A homeless man looks up from a worn-out bench and asks Clint Eastwood, "Can you spare $1?" Instead of simply handing him money, Eastwood pauses, studies the man, and gives an unexpected response. What he says next changes the man's life. Forever. Henry sat hunched on a weathered wooden bench, his tattered jacket pulled tight against the cool, coastal breeze rolling in from the Pacific. The streets of Carmel by the sea were calm, the kind of town where the world seemed to move a little slower, where the air smelled of salt and fresh brewed coffee. His fingers twitched from the morning chill, but he was used to that. He was used to a lot of things: empty pockets, weary stares from passers-by, and the gnawing hunger that had become his constant companion as he sat, watching the world go. By his gaze settled on an older man stepping out of the cafe across the street. Tall, lean, dressed in a simple but well-kept jacket, there was something about him that made Henry hesitate. He recognized the face, rugged and lined with years of experience. Clint Eastwood. Even Henry, despite having spent years on the streets, knew who he was. He had seen his movies once, a lifetime ago, back when things were different, back when he was just another guy trying to get by in the world. Henry swallowed hard, pushing past the knot of hesitation in his throat. He had asked for change from 100 strangers before. This was no different. He stood and took a step forward. "Hey, mister," he called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Can you spare $1?" Clint Eastwood stopped in his tracks and turned toward him. Henry braced himself for the usual reaction: dismissal, a quick shake of the head, maybe a muttered apology before walking away. But Clint didn't do any of those things. Instead, he studied Henry, his sharp, steely eyes narrowing slightly, as if he was trying to figure something out. Then he asked, "What would you do with it?" Henry felt heat rise in his face. It was the question he hated most, the one that always made him feel smaller than he already did. He shoved his hands into his pockets and rocked on his heels. "Maybe buy a coffee or something," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint didn't move. He just stood there, still looking at him, then slowly nodded. To Henry's surprise, instead of walking away, Clint sat down on the bench beside him. Henry blinked, unsure what to make of it. People usually didn't do that. They either ignored him or dropped a few coins in his cup and left. They certainly didn't sit down to chat. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Henry glanced at Clint out of the corner of his eye, wondering what the hell was happening. Finally, Clint broke the silence. "You ever hear the saying, 'Tough times don't last, but tough people do'?" Henry frowned. "Can't say I have." Clint nodded, as if he expected that. "I know what it's like to be down on your luck," he said, his voice low and steady. "You look at me now and think I got it made, but it wasn't always like this." He leaned back, stretching his long legs out in front of him. "Back when I was starting out, I had nothing. Didn't come from money. Grew up during the Great Depression. My family moved around a lot, just trying to get by. I slept in my car for months when I first got to Hollywood." Henry's brow furrowed. He had never thought about a guy like Clint Eastwood struggling. "You? Sleeping in your car?" Clint chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "You think success just happens? No, it don't. You hustle, you work, and you don't quit, no matter how bad things get, and trust me, they get bad." He turned his gaze back toward Henry. "But here's the thing. No one's coming to save you. No one owes you a damn thing. That $1 you asked for? It won't change your life. Might get you a coffee, but then what?" Henry clenched his jaw, his stomach twisting. He had heard versions of this speech before, always from people who didn't know what it was like to be at rock bottom. But Clint wasn't talking down to him. He wasn't pitying him. He was just stating a fact. Clint let the silence hang between them before speaking again. "You ever worked before?" Henry scoffed. "Course I have. Used to be in construction. Good at it too. But things fell apart. One bad break led to another and, well, He gestured vaguely at himself. "Here I am." Clint nodded as if he understood. "Yeah, life has a way of kicking you when you're down. But you know what I learned? You can take the hit and stay down, or you can get back up." He tapped his fingers on his knee thoughtfully. "Ever heard of the saying, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime?" Henry sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, I know what it means. But what if a man don't got a fishing rod or a lake to fish in?" Clint smirked. "Then he finds one." Henry let out a humorless chuckle. "Easier said than done." Clint turned to him fully now. "So everything is, but that's what separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tell me something, Henry. You want to be here, sitting on this bench 5 years from now, asking for another dollar?" Henry flinched at the thought. 5 more years of this? 5 more years of empty pockets, cold nights, and the weight of being invisible. The idea made his chest tighten. He swallowed hard, looking away. "No," he admitted, barely above a whisper. Clint nodded, satisfied with the answer. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and held them up between 2 fingers. "This," he said, "it won't fix anything. But if you're willing to do something about your situation, I might have another idea." Henry looked at the money, then up at Clint. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than despair. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was hope. Whatever it was, it made him sit up a little straighter. "I'm listening." Clint reached down, picking up a small stone from the ground, turning it over in his fingers as if it carried the weight of something more than just the earth beneath them. He studied it for a moment before glancing at Henry. "You ever hear that saying? Give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime." Henry let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, I've heard it," he said. "But what if a man ain't got a rod, a lake, or anything to fish with? What's he supposed to do then?" Clint nodded slowly, letting the question settle in the space between them. "That's where most people give up," he said finally. "But a man can always find a way." Henry rubbed his hands together, trying to chase away the lingering cold in his bones. "Easy for you to say," he muttered. "You ain't the one sitting out here with nothing." Clint sighed, tossing the stone into the street. "You think I always had something?" he asked. "Let me tell you a story." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice calm but firm. "Back before anyone knew my name. Before the movies, before the directing, hell, before I had $2 to rub together, I was just another guy trying to make it. Didn't have a safety net, didn't have anyone handing me anything. I took whatever work I could find. Sometimes, jobs I never thought I'd do. I once spent a whole summer digging pools in the heat of California just to make enough money to eat." Henry scoffed. "Yeah, but you had a job to take." Clint turned to him. "Because I went out and found it." He let the words sink in, before continuing. "It wasn't about the money, Henry. It was about proving to myself that I could do something about my situation. That I had control, even if it was just a little. That's what most people don't realize. You wait around for life to hand you a break, and you'll be waiting forever." Henry exhaled through his nose, his gaze dropping to the ground. He wanted to believe that, wanted to think there was still something left in him that could fight. But it had been so long since he'd felt like more than a burden. He opened his mouth to respond, but Clint was already on his feet, dusting off his jeans. "Come on," Clint said, gesturing with his head. Henry hesitated. "Where we going?" Clint didn't answer, just started walking, and for reasons he didn't quite understand, Henry found himself following. They walked in silence for a few blocks, the sounds of the small town filling the gaps where words should be. The scent of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the crisp air, and soon enough they stopped in front of a small diner. Clint pushed the door open, the little bell above jingling as they stepped inside. The place was cozy, but not fancy. Red, vinyl booths, checkered floors, and the smell of sizzling bacon hanging thick in the air. A middle-aged man stood behind the counter, wiping down a coffee pot with a rag. His eyes flicked up at the sight of Clint, and his face immediately softened with recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said, setting the pot down. "Haven't seen you in a while." Clint smiled. "Been busy." He gestured toward Henry. "You got any work for a man willing to earn a meal?" The diner owner's expression shifted, his gaze moving over Henry with the kind of scrutiny Henry had grown used to. He could see the hesitation, the unspoken judgment, the doubt in whether or not he was worth the trouble. Henry clenched his jaw, bracing himself for rejection. "I don't know," the owner said slowly. "Not looking to hire right now." Clint didn't flinch. "Not asking you to hire him, just asking if he can wash a few dishes, wipe down some tables, maybe sweep the floor in exchange for a sandwich and a cup of coffee." The owner glanced between them again before exhaling sharply. "You vouch for him?" Clint nodded once. The owner sighed. "All right," he said, tossing the rag over his shoulder. "Aprons are in the back." Henry blinked, caught off guard. He had been expecting a handout, not an opportunity. He turned to Clint, uncertain. "You serious?" Clint met his eyes, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do it," he said simply. "But if you want to change something, here's your chance." Henry swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists. Something in him resisted, some deep-rooted shame, whispering that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. He wasn't supposed to be standing in a diner, debating whether or not to wash dishes for a sandwich. He used to be someone. He used to have a job, a home, a purpose. But then again, he also used to have a full stomach and a warm bed, and those things weren't his reality anymore. He took a breath and nodded. "All right," he said. Clint patted him on the back, then stepped aside as Henry made his way toward the kitchen. The diner owner handed him an apron and gestured toward the sink full of dishes. "Hope you know what you're doing," the man muttered. Henry rolled up his sleeves. "I'll figure it out." The work was harder than he expected. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, weren't as steady as they once were. The soap burned the cracks in his skin, and the constant stream of hot water made his fingers ache. But as he scrubbed, rinsed, and stacked the dishes, something strange happened. For the first time in a long time, he felt useful. There was no pity in the soap suds, no judgment in the plates. There was just work. And work he could do. By the time he finished, his back ached and his fingers were pruned, but when the diner owner slid a plate with a sandwich and a steaming cup of coffee across the counter, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. He sat down at a booth, the warmth of the coffee seeping into his fingers as he wrapped them around the mug. He took a bite of the sandwich, the simple act of eating something he had earned, making it taste better than any meal he had in a long time. He glanced toward Clint, who sat across from him, watching with a small, knowing smile. Henry swallowed, his bite setting the sandwich down. "That was your plan all along, wasn't it?" Clint shrugged. "Just wanted to see if you were willing to take the first step." Henry took another sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had taken a step forward instead of falling further behind. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. Henry hadn't expected to come back to the diner. At first, he thought that washing dishes for a meal was just a one-time thing, a brief moment where he had let his pride slip away long enough to take what was offered. But the next day, as his stomach grumbled and the cold morning air bit at his skin, he found his feet carrying him back to that red vinyl booth. The diner owner raised an eyebrow when Henry stepped inside. But he didn't. "And tell him to leave. Back again," the man asked. Henry shrugged. "Needs some work." The owner studied him for a moment, then tossed him an apron. "Dishes are stacking up." Henry didn't argue. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, the warmth of the kitchen easing the stiffness in his fingers. As he scrubbed, he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rhythm, of purpose, even if it was just for an hour or two. He wasn't just sitting outside, waiting for someone to spare him $1. He was doing something. The days passed, and Henry kept returning. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. Each day, Clint showed up, always with the same calm, observant demeanor. He never acted like Henry was a charity case. He just sat with him, talked and listened when Henry felt like speaking. One afternoon, Henry found himself saying more than he intended. "I used to be a construction worker," he muttered, staring into his coffee. "Good at it, too. Spent years building houses, fixing things up, paid well, kept me busy. Then the layoffs came. Boss said it wasn't personal, but it sure as hell felt that way. After that, things went bad. Got to drinking, and once I started, I couldn't stop." Clint didn't react, didn't look at him with pity, and Henry appreciated that. "Lost my job, lost my apartment, lost people who used to call me a friend." Henry exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Once you fall far enough, people stop looking at you like you're human. They just see the mess." Clint nodded, letting the words settle. Then, after a moment, he spoke. "You ever think about picking up a hammer again?" Henry scoffed. "Who the hell would hire me?" Clint leaned back, tapping his fingers against the table. "I might know a guy." Henry frowned. "Come on, man. Ain't nobody gonna take a chance on someone like me." Clint's gaze was steady. "Why not?" Henry hesitated. He could list 1,000 reasons. Because he'd been on the street too long, because his hands weren't as steady as they used to be, because the weight of failure still sat heavy in his chest. "I don't know," he muttered. "Just seems too far gone." Clint shook his head. "That's a load of crap," he said simply. "You think you're the first man to hit rock bottom? The first one who had to crawl his way back up? The world doesn't owe you a damn thing, Henry, but it doesn't stop you from earning something for yourself." Henry swallowed hard, staring down at his hands. He wanted to believe that, wanted to think it wasn't too late. "I'll set up a meeting," Clint said. "You show up, you prove yourself. Rest is on you." Henry hesitated for a long time, before finally nodding. "All right," he said, though his voice barely carried above a whisper. "I'll give it a shot." The next morning, Clint led Henry to a construction site on the edge of town. The place was alive with the sounds of hammers, saws, and voices shouting directions over the din. Henry's heart pounded as they approached a stocky man in a hard hat, arms crossed over his chest. "This him?" the man asked, nodding toward Henry. Clint nodded. "Henry, this is Mike. Henry's looking for a second chance." Mike studied Henry, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You ever lay a foundation?" Henry nodded. "Yeah, used to do framing, roofing too." Mike grunted. "That's so? What happened?" Henry hesitated. Lying wouldn't do him any good. "Got into drinking. Lost my job. Lost everything." He straightened his shoulders. "Been trying to turn things around." Mike didn't react right away, just kept watching him like he was sizing up a piece of lumber. Finally, he jerked his chin toward a stack of supplies. "See those boards? Get 'em sorted and measured. Do it right, and we'll talk about keeping you around." Henry exhaled. This was it. Without another word, he walked over to the stack and got to work. His hands shook at first, nerves threatening to take over, but soon the old muscle memory kicked in. He measured, cut, stacked. His body ached from the effort, unused to the labor after so long on the streets. But he didn't stop. He pushed through, sweat dripping down his brow, his arms burning. Hours passed, and when he finally straightened up, Mike was watching. The foreman stepped over, nodding in approval. "Not bad," he admitted. "Think you can show up again tomorrow?" Henry's throat tightened. He nodded. "Yeah, I can." Mike clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, we start at 6. Henry could hardly believe it. He had a job, a real job. As he walked away from the site, Clint fell into step beside him. "How's it feel?" Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized. He'd been holding. "Feels like maybe I ain't done yet." Clint smiled, a rare thing. "That's because you're not." Henry didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he had something to wake up for. And that was enough to start with. Henry barely recognized himself anymore. The reflection, staring back at him from the small bathroom mirror in his apartment, showed a man who had reclaimed his dignity. His beard was gone, his hair neatly trimmed, his clothes clean. His shoulders, once slumped from the weight of failure, stood square with quiet confidence. The tired, beaten-down man who had once begged outside a cafe felt like a ghost from another life. The days of uncertainty had been replaced with hard work, structure, and purpose. He woke up before dawn, showed up to the construction site early, and put in the effort. Over time, his co-workers came to respect him, not because they knew where he had come from, but because he proved himself with every swing of the hammer, every beam he lifted, every house he helped build. With each paycheck, he set a little aside until, finally, he could afford a place of his own. It wasn't much, just a small apartment with the basics, but it was his. After years of sleeping on benches and under bridges, having a door to lock, a bed to sleep in, and a place to call home felt like a miracle. One evening, after a long day's work, Henry found himself walking past the same cafe where everything had changed. The air was crisp, the glow of the streetlights warm against the pavement. He stopped for a moment, letting the memory wash over him, how he had sat on that same bench, tired, hopeless, asking a stranger for $1. How that stranger, instead of giving him money, had given him something far greater, a chance to stand on his own 2 feet. As he turned to leave, he noticed a man sitting hunched over in the same spot he had once occupied. His clothes were tattered, his hands dirty, his eyes filled with the same quiet desperation Henry had once known so well. "Hey, mister," the man mumbled, glancing up. "Can you spare $1?" Henry felt a smile tug at the corner of his lips. He stepped closer, recognizing the moment for what it was. This was more than coincidence. This was life coming full circle. Instead of reaching into his pocket, he sat down on the bench beside the man. He looked him in the eye, the way Clint had once looked at him, and asked, "Tell me, what would you do with it?"